Hello and a very warm welcome to episode 3 of the policing TV series Manifesto for Change, Preventing Male Violence in Policing. I'm Professor Louise Mullany from the University of Nottingham. I've worked in the area of gender and workplace communication, including in policing, for the last 25 years, and I'm going to be your chair for this session. This is the third in a series of 6 episodes, and today we're going to be focusing on insights into police perpetrators. We will explore attractiveness of policing to both predatory and opportunistic perpetrators, vetting, different interventions, and explore the evidence base of what works in order to bring about long-term change. To do this, we'll be drawing on a range of expert evidence from both inside and outside of policing to engage ourselves in informed debate. Throughout 2021, the policing of violence against women and girls has come under significant scrutiny. There is acknowledgement that police forces are consistently failing to protect women and girls from sexual and violent crime and from violence at the hands of police officers and staff. Many have compared the kidnap, rape and murder of Sarah Everard as a watershed moment for policing, in a similar vein to the murder of Stephen Lawrence. The gap between what the public need from policing and what they get, especially for women, people of colour and those from marginalised communities, has grown significantly. Trust, confidence and legitimacy for many in policing is broken. Within this context, the intention of each episode is to explore how policing actually works so we can better understand why it goes wrong and whether there are solutions that can address systemic failings. Our aim is for all of our episodes to include recommendations and create radical and deliverable interventions through open discussion and debate. I will now introduce each panel member to you for episode 3. And so first of all, we have Faye Sweeting. Faye is a lecturer and researcher in forensic psychology. Prior to this, she was a police officer for Dorset Police, joining in 2004, where she worked in a variety of roles, including response and as an informant handler. In 2017, she was awarded a bursary from the College of Policing to complete an MSc in Investigative Forensic Psychology at Bournemouth University. Her final year project examined the attrition problem in rape investigations. And then in 2018, she began a PhD funded by the police and Bournemouth University to investigate potential risk factors in police officers who abuse their positions for a sexual purpose. She has recently submitted her PhD thesis and then changed careers to lecturing and research. She is a member of 2 National Police Chief Council's working groups, one on abuse of position and the other on sexual harassment. And she has been invited to speak at a number of police conferences around the UK. Her research was recently featured on the UK Channel 4 Dispatches programme, Cops on Trial. Our next panellist is Sylvia Cole. Sylvia is an investigative psychologist trained in expert domestic violence risk assessment. She works for Ahimsa, a pioneering respect-accredited organisation, and one of the first in the UK to work with men who perpetrate domestic abuse. She advises on risk and safeguarding issues, manages behaviour of high-risk, high-harm cases for a local police IMO project, and leads a local stalking project. Sylvia graduated in psychology from Western University in Canada and completed her MSc in investigative psychology at the University of Huddersfield, where her dissertation on male perpetrators' perspectives behind their coercive and controlling behaviours earned her her distinction. She is interested in addressing police-perpetrated domestic abuse through identification, risk assessment, and behavioural change. Next, we have Colin Fitzgerald. Colin has been delivering individual and group-based work with men to address their use of violence and abuse to intimate partners for over 17 years. He is currently the Perpetrator Services Implementation and Development Manager for Solace Women's Aid, where he pioneered Sea Change, a trauma-informed response to perpetrators in the London Borough of Bexley. He has also worked on Prevent and Change, a Home Office-funded project in London, working with serial perpetrators of abuse, as well as the Domestic Violence Prevention Programme. Previously, he's delivered group-based interventions across London and also in Brighton and Hove Albion in the UK. He has delivered the programme for DIVP and the London Probation Service and specialist parenting programmes for fathers in regard to domestic violence. He has provided seminars, training and consultancy to a variety of statutory agencies, including the Home Office and the Mayor's Office of Police and Crime, as well as NGOs both in the UK and also internationally. He has also conducted published research into effective interventions with domestic violence perpetrators. And our final panellist today is DCC Maggie Blyth. Maggie is Deputy Chief Constable and was appointed as the National Police Chiefs Council's lead for violence against women and girls in October 2021. This gives responsibility for overseeing the national policing response to violence against women and girls. Maggie's previous role was as Assistant Chief Constable with Hampshire Constabulary, with responsibility for all matters relating to local policing and to public protection. This includes the safeguarding and protection of vulnerable people and the forced response to violence against women and girls. Maggie has over 30 years' experience in safeguarding and also in public protection. She initially worked in the probation service across London and Thames Valley in the 1990s. She then worked throughout her career in youth justice services and within child protection, prior to joining policing as a superintendent in 2016. She became the Portsmouth City Commander in 2017. She set up the Oxfordshire Youth Offending Services in the late 1990s, going on to work at the National Youth Justice Board with oversight of youth justice services for England and Wales during the early 2000s. She then spent a decade as an independent chair of Kent, Oxfordshire, Hampshire and Isle of Wight Safeguarding Children's Boards, alongside a ministerial appointment as an independent member of the Parole Board for England and Wales. She has published several books on children at risk, completed postgraduate qualifications in education and criminal justice and policing, and she is particularly interested in how public services work together to protect communities effectively from high risk and high harm crimes to reduce vulnerability. Maggie completed the National Police Strategic Command course in 2019, becoming a Chief Officer for Policing. And so we will now begin our focus on insights into police perpetrators. And I'm going to start off by posing the same opening question to all of our panel members. And we're going to start off with you, Faye. So Faye, this is going to be a two-part question. What do you think makes policing attractive to those men who commit violence against women and girls? And the second part, is this disproportionate to other professions and careers? So Faye, over to you.
Thank you, Louise. When I look at some of the research that has gone before I became involved in researching abusive position, one of the things that really came through to me, apart from the fact that there's very little research in this specific area, is that researchers link the environment of policing to misconduct, sexual misconduct and corruption more generally. And you know, all the typical things of policing, such as lone working, unsocial hours, shift working and access to vulnerable people, do certainly afford opportunities for people who wish to misuse their role, to exploit them. And that's some of the things that I've seen in my research. The other aspect that researchers pick up on is that some roles are particularly stressful and particularly high pressured, and that this can sometimes be linked to corruption as well, an increased risk of corruption, especially if those perpetrators have pre-existing issues such as financial substance abuse issues, for example. So I think if you were to join the police in order to misuse your role, those aspects, those elements that you would be aware that you might be able to abuse, that you might be able to exploit for your own purpose, could potentially make it an attractive role, to answer your first part of the question. I do caveat that by saying that I personally believe abusive position is a very rare behaviour in police officers, and that the majority of police officers would never behave in such a way. The disproportionality question is rather harder to answer, I think. I think that when these cases of abusive position in particular get into the media, they do get a lot of attention, and I think that's rightly so. I think the public have an interest in these cases. They need to know what has happened. They need to know if they can trust the police. And I think as well that the police's requirement to publish the misconduct hearing results online in the interest of transparency also encourages media interest. The NHS, teaching, politics don't have to have those same sort of requirements to publish results. So I think it does push these forward, and especially if there's a spate of cases, which there does appear to be in the last 6 months or so, quite a few high profile cases, it can look like there is a real problem in policing that maybe is disproportionate. I'm not sure. What I can say though is that in the army, there is research into very similar behaviour. The army is recognised to be a very masculine career, as is the police, and that this can sometimes be linked to sexual misconduct in particular. There's been some quite interesting research looking at how the culture sort of enables sexual misconduct as well. So there's a lot going on, And I think that culture is prevalent in other organisations as well. So it's very difficult for me to answer that entirely, but I believe that there are some aspects such as the media interest which may make it look more disproportionate.
Thank you, Faye. That was a really good start for us. Maggie, I'm going to come to you next. So just to repeat the question, what makes policing attractive to those men who commit violence against women and girls? And then the second part, do you think this is disproportionate to other professions or careers? So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. And it was interesting listening to Faye in her response. I suppose, firstly, as a context, and anyone who's worked in public protection knows that misogynist, racist, disrespectful attitudes and behaviours in society will be reflected in those agencies working in public protection too, and that will apply to policing. It matters more in policing, I think, because of the powers that police officers hold and the legitimacy that we must have and need to have with our public. So I think in some ways, if you work in public protection, you know the level of misogyny, of bad behaviour that exists in society, and therefore it will exist in some of the professional sectors too, which includes policing. I think there is an element of recognising that there will be some individuals attracted to policing and other professions too, for the wrong reasons. The power and influence it affords some individuals due to the intrusive intrusive powers that police officers have, the access to vulnerable individuals, and the ability perhaps to coerce people to get their own way. Those are characters and traits that we know are rife amongst perpetrators, and therefore there will be some individuals that use the opportunity that getting into a career like policing brings to enhance them. So it will exist, and I think it exists in other professions too. I think, is it disproportionate to other careers? We don't, I think, as Faye said, have any research to show that. I think as we shine the light, which is certainly what's happening at the moment in policing, as we shine the light on that behaviour and root it out, we are likely to see more cases coming to light. And therefore that gives a perception of things getting worse, when actually perhaps it's a case of holding individuals to account and holding organisations to account to root out that behaviour. So I think there is no evidence to show that policing is worse than any other careers, but that access to power, that access to vulnerable individuals, and that ability to coerce others to get your own way are opportunities that could exist in policing, and arguably in some other professions too. And certainly working a long time in public protection and safeguarding across different parts of the public sector, I've seen similar individuals attracted into teaching, for example, who may have a harmful interest in children, and also social care. So that is why we have to be absolutely rigorous in upholding very high standards, higher in policing, I would argue, than other professions, and then having means to root that out.
Thank you, Maggie, that's great. Right, I'm going to come next to Sylvia. So Sylvia, if you'd like to take the floor and give us your response to the question, say what's making policing attractive to men who commit violence against women and girls, and do you think it's disproportionate to other professions and careers, building on what's been said already? Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Maggie and Faye. I do agree with what you have been saying. Looking at it from perpetrators' perspective, as we work with high risk, high harm domestic abuse perpetrators, what would make policing attractive to women and girls? It would be the power and control that it brings. And looking at it perhaps from their perspective, it would be to try and regain their self-image, to regain that power and control, to improve their self-image. So people might be attracted to careers like the police or any other career that might give them that that power and control back, that they may have lost through their childhood or through their experiences that they have encountered throughout their lives where it was taken away from them. So it could be, you know, careers like military or judges, or like you say, teachers, or even, you know, the church, to try and to regain that power and control. And if it's disproportionate to, you know, to other careers, I think it's, you know, also, you know, to Kevin Dutton, he is a psychologist that studied the wisdom of psychopaths, and he found that policing is in the top 10 careers that psychopaths choose, you know, for their ability to detach and influence, their opportunity to influence people, to manipulate people to get what they're wanting with their superficial charm. But also, it could also depend a little bit, I think, on the sort of biopsychosocial model. So if you imagine it to be like a gun, so the bio side is your genes, and that would mean that you've got the gun. The psychology side, the personality, is like you cock the gun, and the social side, the environment, would be to pull the trigger. So you need a combination of all three of those for it to effectively fire. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sylvia. So Colin, we'll come to you as our final panelist to respond to this first question. If you can take the floor now and give us your response. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Yeah, I agree with an awful lot of what's been said already, and I think Sylvia made a really important point around the idea of sort of power and control being an element of this. And I think, you know, positions of authority, I think, naturally lend themselves to, there's a definite link up there. And I think, I don't think actually the fundamentals change very much across the board. I think when you look at men's behaviour in terms of their abuse and how that abuse happens, as Sylvia's already mentioned, you know, you find elements of power and control within that. And I think when you're having discussion with men, actually what comes up, they're not necessarily framing it in those words, but ideas of entitlement in certain circumstances, that they were entitled to behave in a certain way. You know, those sort of ideas and elements are largely there. And I think if once you've got those kind of basics or those fundamentals there, then I think you then look, as Sylvia sort of mentioned, to the environment and the culture in which you exist, and it's then what you can co-opt, I guess, as part of that culture. So if you're in an organisation whereby it's possible to use your standing, use the things at your command, and you've got that sense of entitlement, that's the ideal that you know, this behaviour is something that you can both do and get away with, then you are going to co-opt the things that are available to you. And how many people naturally choose that with that in mind, I think that's difficult to say, but I think it stands to reason that, you know, if organised crime is clever enough to think that it might be useful to have some people on the inside of policing, then it's probably reasonable to suspect that other people will have had similar ideas. And I do agree with Faye. I know I've met an awful lot of police officers over the years, and the vast majority of them, I'm happy to say, are doing excellent work. But I think that these kind of cases obviously are of enormous profile, rightly. In terms of other professions and whether or not this is disproportionate, again, I can't point to any particular research in that regard. I think that it's probably under-researched. But what immediately springs to mind is that you do see similar patterns, I would argue, of high-profile, in high-profile cases across other parts of society, whereby that idea of power and control, and I guess high levels of entitlement exist. So the most obvious one that springs to mind would be high-profile sportsmen, for example. There's been a number of cases in connected to things like American football, and football in the UK, for example, with footballers who have behaved abusively. I would say you probably, in my experience of the work that I've been doing, it's not, met lots of people, and I think there's a plethora of people. There's not necessarily one type or one profession, from things like banking, even law. So I think if you look, you will find, you know, if you take the opportunity to look into the institutions that we're talking about, inevitably you will find people within those institutions that are co-opting their positions to facilitate their abuse.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Colin. So I want to move us on now to thinking about when recruitment takes place, and to think about the issue of vetting and what goes on in that space currently. So is vetting currently effective in identifying perpetrators? And what needs to be done to improve this first line of defence for the integrity of policing at this initial level of recruitment? So going back right to the very beginning of when people decide to join particular areas of policing. So Maggie, can I come to you first on this, please, and get your thoughts on the vetting process and what your own evaluation of what is currently happening, whether it's working, what needs to change in that regard? Thank you.
Thank you. And again, sort of linking back to Colin's point that where you have a situation with some individuals deliberately seeking out a course of life or a profession because of power, or to embark on a course of conduct that is not what we would want, it's always challenging to root that out, and we need to do it in every walk of life. So vetting is one really important element in policing, being sure that the individuals entering an organisation, a police force, are able to and signed up to living up to the course of conduct, the high standards, ethical behaviour that we would expect of anyone in policing. So absolutely essential to have vetting as part of the process of recruitment. But it cannot be a panacea for everything. It can't oversee somebody's lifestyle, somebody's life 24/7 for 12 months of the year. So I'll put it into some context. We have a vetting code of practice and authorised professional practice approved by the College of Policing, which sets out the statutory requirements for any police force around vetting, and the ability to deviate from those standards are strictly limited. And would have to be underwritten by a relevant chief officer. That's the level of detail that vetting goes into. That they would have to be recorded and reviewed if they were ever deviated from, which would be very unlikely. So the way that vetting works is it's run by each organisation, and it looks into a range of information and material. They are dedicated, trained staff within forces that oversee vetting units in line with those national standards that I outlined. And they look into all sorts of information and detail around the level of risk that an individual interested in joining policing presents, or threat, anything around their background that needs to be taken into account. It's a comprehensive check on local and national police force systems. It looks at open source social media profiles, associations, friends, links to the individual, family, financial checks. And much of that will depend on the level of vetting the individual requires, because there's different vetting dependent on the types of job or role that police officers hold at different ranks. And that vetting is subject to renewal. And again, there are different levels of vetting and renewal dependent on the role that police officers are holding. So for higher levels of vetting, those checks would be undertaken annually. For lower levels, it would be undertaken much less frequently. It will also be subject to renewal when an individual moves to a different police force. And again, there's very stipulated, strict guidance about what that revisiting of vetting would look like for transferees. So you can see that there's a very, very clear set of expectations and standards set by the College of Policing nationally that every police force must adhere to. But that vetting is a moment in time. and for any individual intent on misusing their powers, intent on corruption, intent on behaving in any form of criminality, and within that I would include violence against women and girls, then there is always going to be room for moving around that system. And that's where it's really important that vetting is seen as just one part of the approach that we would take in policing to ensuring a call-out culture at all levels. And that means that the behaviour that any officer or individual or member of staff shows that falls below the standards we set in policing, we ask that other team members, the immediate supervisor, is keeping a tab and challenging anything that looks out of the ordinary or looks suspicious or looks like there needs to be a review or a check and balance against that individual's behaviour. So vetting is really, really important, but it cannot alone be the only thing that roots out the type of behaviour and conduct we've seen in some of the cases that have come to light very recently. I hope that sort of gives a bit of a context.
Yeah, definitely. I think that gives a really good overview of what the current situation is. If you were going to change something with the vetting process, what would it be? If there was an opportunity to redress it or to look at the code of conduct or code of practice?
It is being refreshed and reviewed at the moment, which I think is timely, and I think it's a question of all, not just chief officers, but leaders, managers, and supervisors being conscious of the need to always stick to those standards, which I know will be high on any chief's list of things to do, absolutely high. But I think that the bit that I would say needs to be considered most is that vetting alone won't prevent somebody behaving in a way that is corrupt or causing harm to either another member of the workforce or indeed a member of the public. And that for me is where frontline supervisors and frontline supervisory oversight of a team in setting that culture, that call-out culture, encouraging other members of the team to come forward where they observe behaviour out in the street or out when on patrol or in any form of policing activity. That call-out culture is supported by the immediate line managers, and that whistleblowing mechanisms are used and that conduct is challenged immediately, because I think that's as important, if not more important than vetting, because it's that sort of supervisory oversight and cultural leadership that will allow behaviour that is suspect to be challenged and brought to the fore. So I think it's a focus on our leadership, on our culture, and on our challenge that is really important in this regard. And some of those cases that we're seeing at the moment, and we know there will be more down the pipeline, have actually come to light because other colleagues and team members have called them out and have had the confidence and courage to come forward because they've seen behaviour either out and about or have come across it online. We've seen the recent WhatsApp behaviour, and that is really important to be supported, and making sure that those individuals who do call out the behaviour are also supported within our policing, within our police forces and our organisations, because I think that's where we can continue to keep shining the light and keep drawing a line on this absolutely unacceptable behaviour.
Thank you very much, Maggie. You've picked up on some really important points, particularly around culture there, and we've covered those already in episode 1 and 2, and I know we'll come back to picking up on the idea of culture and changing culture probably later on today and also in our other episodes as well. Colin, could I come to you next, please, for your thoughts on vetting and current processes and procedures?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, I largely agree with pretty much everything Maggie's just said. I think it's a really important part of the process, and I think inevitably, unfortunately, as part of that process, it won't be perfect. There will be people that it will rightly draw your attention to, and there will be other people that, for whatever reason, manage to get through processes despite how they're set up, and kind of go on to behave in ways that we know are unacceptable. I think in terms of making those processes useful, and I don't claim to know enough about how they're set up within the police to be able to say this with any great authority. So I'd be interested to see what Maggie has to add to this. But it would seem to me that you will also need a process whereby you can learn from things when they go wrong. And I think one of the most helpful, certainly, you know, if you look at across the board in terms of cases within sort of social care, the NHS, things like that, where we've actually learned things and made differences, is when things have gone wrong, and we've taken a forensic sort of look at those and learned from what happens. And again, without trying to stray too hard, you know, too much into the sort of culture debate that you've said you've already had, but I think those things really matter within that. I think the institutions and how they encourage people to come forward, talk about things, discuss things when they go wrong. I'm not suggesting you would implement the same system, for example, you know, within the airline industry. That's a very, obviously, if things go wrong within the airline industry, there's a massive fallout for that. So they've set up a system whereby people can come forward and talk about stuff. Now, I'm not suggesting that the same system would work within policing, because I think that you're looking at a different process, but I think it's so important. And I think that within that, what you also need is you need to be confident that actually, as part of your vetting process for the people that are doing the supervision and the supervising, that they feel confident and able to take the actions that they need to take when they see stuff that you know that shouldn't be happening. So I think it's really important. Whether it will give you everything you need, I think, coming back to Maggie's point, I think it can't work in isolation. It has to be in combination with sort of other sort of work policies.
Thank you, Colin. Sylvia, can I come to you now for your thoughts on this, building on what's been said already? Okay.
Yeah, so with vetting, if it's currently effective, there are currently police officers that are serving that have been vetted, yet they are still perpetrators of domestic abuse and sexual violence. So if you look at, for example, if women make up false allegations, there's less than 2% of women make up false allegations of rape, for example. Also, there's less than 2% of perpetrators getting charged or convicted for rape, which is completely in the opposite direction. And if you consider that police officers are 1/3 as likely to get a conviction or a charge on rape, that leaves next to nobody being charged or convicted or dealt with in any positive manner. So it does definitely need looking into, and I think, you know, it is important to hear the victims of police perpetrated domestic abuse or sexual gain or abuse of power, listen to them, you know, and rebuild the trust, perhaps by going back on allegations made. If there's only 2% of allegations are false allegations, it doesn't matter if it ended up in a conviction or not. They should be reinvestigated and looked at. And taken seriously. With vetting as well, the only sort of objective basis to look at would be, you know, going back and looking at static risk factors, because that predicts, you know, what happened in the past can predict what will happen in the future. So, you know, things like mental health issues or alcohol, attachment problems, domestic abuse in their previous relationships, you know, the sort of relationships that they have had, you know, with their past partners, those sort of things. The stuff that they can't change that's already happened in their history would be, you know, a good start for vetting, because currently security clearance versus developed vetting, it would have, you know, many more intrusive questions. And considering that, you know, police officers have such a ability to and access to be able to contact these vulnerable people and general public or anybody. You'd think that, you know, it would be a little bit more scrutinized, you know, what has happened in their past, allegations included.
Thank you, Sylvia. So Faye, finally, we'll come to you for your thoughts on vetting and picking up on any ideas that have been brought to the table so far. Thank you.
I completely agree with what Maggie said about vetting being a moment in time, and that you can go as far as you possibly can in that moment. You can look at social media, you can look at as much information that's possibly available. And I completely accept Sylvia and Colin's points that doesn't prevent everybody getting through that shouldn't be getting through. And one of the things that I looked at throughout my PhD with Dr. Terry Cole, my PhD supervisor, and Professor Peter Hills, was sexual misconduct, specifically within the training environment. And one of the things that we found when we spoke to police trainers from 5 different forces was there were some concerns that unsatisfactory recruits, not just for sexual misconduct, but a number of different issues, were somehow getting through that vetting and recruitment process and being accepted. And one particular example I was given was one of the participants in the research, police trainer. They'd say things like, "Oh, I hear such and such who's member of police staff or PCSO or special is applying to join the police. Oh, they'll never get in, they're absolutely horrendous, they're misogynistic, they're sexist, racist," and then 2 weeks later they're training them. So there were some concerns that the process just needs to go a little bit further to make sure that these people are not getting in the first place. Another concern that the trainers had was, like, almost from day one, recruits were very reluctant to report wrongdoing and to stand up for those who had experienced sexual misconduct during the training sessions, or at training events, work events, or over WhatsApp, for example, which was kind of concerning that you might expect that would take longer to develop, but actually was present within training. And I'm aware of some amazing initiatives by forces to try and encourage more reporting and more upstanding, which is fantastic. But one of the things that could possibly be looked at, and this is something we're looking to pilot very shortly at BU, is psychometric testing in addition to vetting. So there is some quite interesting research from the US linking certain aspects of personality to an increased risk of corruption in the police, using quite readily available, very valid, very venerable psychological tests. So I wonder if this could potentially be a way forward. Again, it's never going to capture everybody, but even if it just pulls out 2 or 3 per intake that really shouldn't be in the police, then it could be worth doing.
Excellent, thank you, Faye. That's really, really interesting to put that on the table as an alternative method. I just want to come back to you just on the issue of training, because you've got expertise in this area. Are there any recommendations that you would have to? It's really interesting that the culture kicks in straight away, and that kind of training process is something that new recruits will learn very, very quickly. Are there any recommendations or things that you could put forward for trainers to be able to throw up red flags, or for this to be thrown up? Okay, you've got through the vetting, but now we can see these particular issues. What could happen in that space that could potentially put another barrier in the way if people are showing very disturbing behavior at that very initial career stage?
One of the things that the trainers mentioned to me almost universally was that the counter-corruption unit would come in on the first couple of weeks of training and delivering input to recruits. And there were some concerns that maybe this was a bit too strong, and possibly was a bit frightening. That in the first couple of days, you must do this if you see this, you must do this if you see that. Some concern maybe that it could be slightly softened more from the approach of, we, your counter-corruption unit, we're actually here to help you. We're to help you support people who've experienced things that are wrong. We're here to help you to report, to facilitate reporting. I wonder if that is a potential way forward. If that's the case, that's happening in other forces where that first input is maybe a bit too strong, too scary, that maybe it could be delivered in conjunction with the trainers. Say, look, we're very much a team here. We work with the counter-corruption unit. They work with us. We're here to help you and support you. And also for trainers to have more of a dialogue with counter-corruption units. If there are some concerns about how someone's behaving that maybe haven't been complained about, but is something that's worrying them, that there is that open channel of dialogue. They can go and talk to people within counter-corruption units, maybe informally at first, just to see if there's any area of concerns from the vetting, or advice, how do we keep an eye on this, how do we continue to be aware of this, or potentially identify people who've been affected by the behaviour.
Thank you. Maggie, do you want to just come in here on the issue of training, particularly thinking around what you've mentioned already in terms of culture and in terms of eradicating or looking to eradicate the kind of misogynistic, sexist, racist culture? Have you got any thoughts on the training process as part of this discussion?
Yes, thank you. Just before I comment on training in terms of cultural change, I think Faye's point about trainers and also coaches, mentors, and supervisors are also key in working together with anti-corruption units, with counter-corruption units, with PS, professional standards departments. We are a team in policing, and it's not a them and us. It's actually around how are we recruiting new individuals, how are we supporting them, training them, and then indeed for established officers and staff, how are individuals who are coming up against poor or bad, at times terrible behaviour, how is that getting tackled? So it's really important that culture of transparency and openness, and what we loosely call a call-out culture, is there for everybody, and I would see that very much the responsibility of those in a training role from day one, and encouraging that amongst teams and new teams of new officers. So that I just wanted to make that point, because I think it's a really important one that Faye said. In terms of how do you change culture, and how do we ensure that those new officers, part of the 20,000 joining at the moment, those more established officers, understand the particular scrutiny that is on policing, and that applies to online behaviour outside work as well as behaviour at work, and that's really, really important to keep discussing. But in terms of changing culture, we're looking nationally through the work that I'm involved in at the notion of being an active bystander, sometimes called an upstander, and there's some really good training packages around, some training taken from the United States that we're looking at whether we can develop that through the College of Policing to give everybody confidence that when they do feel they want to challenge something, it is going to be well supported within the organisation by supervisors, and taken on and seen as the norm, and that's really, really important. So I think anything that focuses on active bystander culture, being an upstander, and looking at behaviour is really important, and a really important opportunity for our male officers and staff to come forward to be part of that change. I think in the past there's been a sense that much of this has fallen on some women or some officers and staff from minoritised backgrounds to come forward if they felt that they were witnessing discriminatory behaviour. And actually it's as much about our male colleagues who still, we have more male colleagues than female in most forces still. It's men to come forward and be part of that active bystander culture as well. I think is really important.
Thank you, Maggie. Sylvia, can I come to you now and get your thoughts on the discussion that we're currently having? And one of the things that I think you and Colin are coming at it from kind of later on in the process. So we've got the induction, we've got the training. You're then coming at the end from the kind of victims, perpetrators perspectives. What do you think policing can do to stop the escalation of violence against women and girls? So if there's start off with kind of low level style offences, and then patterns that we've seen in the recent high profile cases, and as we know from research in terms of the kind of pyramid approach to gender-based violence that quite often starts off low level and then escalates into higher level violence. What can be done to stop that escalation within policing itself, and more broadly speaking? Sylvia, can I get you to pick up on that?
Yes, of course. So I think stopping it, dead in its tracks. It sort of starts off in a triangle, isn't it? With where rape acceptance is, at the bottom, it's sort of locker room banter, jokes and things like that. And at the top, you've got rape. So, recognizing those different stages along the way and preventing them from moving onwards. But just going with the escalation of stuff, you won't change culture change and bystanders if they don't change their beliefs. So that's where it comes from. If they think it's okay to have those sort of that sort of banter and that sort of the misogynistic jokes and things like that, that won't be, their beliefs are still there. You could have people do as many courses as you'd like on, say, misogyny, for example, or, you've got a great cup of tea video that the police have designed saying what is sexual consent. If everybody watched that, then in theory, they wouldn't be perpetrators anymore. But that's not the case. It's because their beliefs aren't being challenged. And I think that's the important bit to identify and to get to the bottom of. So your beliefs, they are influenced by positive and negative reinforcements. So if you believe something, so for example, if they think that they will have some sort of sexual gain by doing whatever action, that is a positive reinforcement because it works. Yeah, so until that becomes a negative reinforcement, showing them that that actually doesn't work anymore for them, that is when they might change their beliefs and their feelings about it and their actions. So that's where I think it should be stemming from, is challenging those beliefs and identifying those.
And how do you do that if you don't do it through training, like through kind of, obviously you've mentioned video-based training, or what kind of routes into the kind of process could you recommend?
It's a long process. That is, what we do on domestic abuse perpetrator programs. If it was a quick fix, Ahimsa has been doing this for 30 years. They were one of the first in the country. And if it was a quick fix to just send somebody on a course, then, they would have already thought of that 30 years ago. They wouldn't be, doing a 40 program. It does take time and challenging, and it has to be done by a very skilled professional that is able to, to challenge them on whatever beliefs that they're having in a very, in a sort of loving way, in a helpful way, rather than in a confrontational way, but challenge their underlying beliefs. And work with them on various things about their insecurities, about their thoughts towards, jealousy and their entitlement or righteousness, their rigid beliefs and things, and constantly be there to challenge and support.
Thank you, Sylvia. Colin, can we come to you now for your thoughts on this and to draw on your experiences within your own career trajectory? So I mentioned you've got 17 years experience working in this, so can you come in?
Yeah, I think Sylvia's right in so much that there is not going to be a quick fix, and I think maybe one of the things to think about in this context is how do you introduce accountability into the system, and the reason I think that's so important is because if you're going to challenge your belief systems, that's likely to happen over a number of ways. Some of that might be around training. Sometimes the most effective thing that you will do is some kind of action and intervention. Sometimes that will be dismissal, or somebody will be arrested. Or if you look at the success of sort of perpetrator work, when it works best is when it works best as part of a system. So it's not a standalone. Okay, you go and see these guys, they go and do this work with you, and you come out the other side. Within that there's a whole kind of system, or should be a whole system of accountability built in. So I do the work that I do with perpetrators, but I'm also responsible for feeding back to my the partner service that's working with his partner and sort of making sure that the information that I've got is kind of matching her information, that I'm doing the right things. My work is recorded. I have someone look at my work to make, question me about the decisions I've made and why I've made them in terms of that work. And then within that, I'm also expected to talk to the police. I'm expected to talk to social services if they're relevant. So there's a whole system of accountability around that perpetrator, and the interventions that a perpetrator gets depends on how that behavior then unfolds. So if the behaviour goes the way we hope it will, and the intervention of the programme works well, that's great. You know, we're getting the feedback from his partner that service is going well, then we can be reasonably confident in that. But sometimes, and I think this is a really important thing about that work in terms of how that was set up, it was always designed to put increasing safety of victims and children at the heart of its work, and that came first, ahead of behaviour change. And I think sometimes we get a little bit lost in what we can do to change things and make things happen in terms of how we're going to change this individual. And sometimes we need to focus a bit more on, okay, and what other things might we use if those hoped for changes do not happen? And in some cases, that will be dismissal from the service, that will be arrest, that will be imprisonment. And the reason I think those things are so important is because, to go back to the, where this conversation started in terms of, well, how do we get other people involved? How do we make other people within a system feel more confident about calling things out and making conversation with their superiors around that behaviour? They need to know that that's going to have some effect. The moment that you realise that actually I've taken the decision to do this, you see it all the time in domestic violence programmes. Maybe a victim of domestic violence has, for want of a better phrase, put her head above the parapet for the first time and decided to confide in somebody. The response that she gets from the people that she confides in will have an absolute material effect on what she does next. And if it's poor and it's bad, you can guarantee she's never going to do it again, because it took so much to get to that point. And I think you have to apply the same thinking and understanding when you're talking to, trainers and colleagues and things like that. It can't just be, well, it can't be surface. It has to result in something. And I think one of the reasons that things are so difficult now in terms of some of the high profile cases we've seen is because what members of the public and people come back to, rightly or wrongly, is the fact that, recently there's been a well publicised case where people have been promoted and people were surprised by this. And I think it's those kind of things that make a massive difference. And at that point, I don't think everyone necessarily sees nuance. What they see is, well, this should have happened and it didn't. So, how can we then have trust in that system? And that's equally as important.
Thank you, Colin. And I want to just pick up on what you've mentioned here in terms of the victims as well, and picking up on, I'll come back to you, Sylvia, on this, because you've picked up on this already in terms of listening to victims and thinking about it from this perspective. So one of the issues that we've got here is that police officers who are perpetrators are seemingly protected and rewarded, whilst victims are penalised or victimised or investigated and outcast. And what can be done in this space to change that narrative? So Sylvia, can I come to you first, and then we'll come to our other panellists?
Yes, I think, like Colin was saying, I 100% agree with what he was saying about, victim blaming. If you don't respond correctly the first time, they're not going to come back. And like I said earlier as well, with the 2% of victims making false allegations versus less than 2%, I think it's 1.3 having a conviction in rape now. It doesn't instill confidence. So I think hearing the victims, listening to them, whether or not the case has been got a conviction or not, just believing what they're saying and reinvestigating and looking into the allegations that they have made, and putting those perpetrators of those allegations under the microscope, regardless of what the outcome was of that case.
Thanks, Sylvia. Faye, can I come to you now, please, for your thoughts on this and on the idea of victim blaming?
I completely agree with Sylvia and Colin, what they're saying about listening to the victims, and also touching on some of the internal sexual misconduct as well. That I believe it was West Midlands Police that I saw speak at a conference recently, where they had some cases of abusive position, and they'd taken each one and done a really deep review of each in order to see what lessons they could have learned from this, what could they do better next time. I think that's absolutely excellent initiative from the force, looking at what's happened, as Colin said, that forensic overview of it, to see how this could possibly be improved. in the future. And I really felt, listening to this officer, her name escapes me at the moment, I'm sure it'll pop back into my head, the way she was talking about the cases, everything that she said, you could tell just how deeply she cared about this and how much it meant to her that this was done correctly. And I think that's fantastic. And then in South Wales, they ran a He for She campaign, where they had male officers read the accounts of victims, female intern police victims of sexual misconduct, in their own voices, which I thought was a very effective way of saying the male officers in this force do not stand for this behaviour, and sort of flipping it around. It's not just the female victims that need to come forward. We're supporting you. We're here for you. And every time I hear these initiatives, my heart just leaps, because I think they're absolutely fantastic. And this is exactly what needs to be done. Some interesting research I've seen within the US Army about looking how to address beliefs that do not sit with policing in a way to try and reduce it. Research by Scott and colleagues, who looked at army recruits and allowed them to freely express what views they had that were negative towards women, what misogynistic views they had, what sexist views they had, in a very free and open environment, and listened to them without judgment, and then used targeted education based on the beliefs that they held, whether that was that women are delicate, fragile beings that should not be in the army, we should be protecting women, they shouldn't be fighting, or sort of more misogynistic, well, both misogynistic, but maybe more dangerous beliefs about women being in the army. And I felt that was a really interesting way of looking at it as well. You could possibly see that working in the police during training.
Thank you, Faye. We've done some similar work within universities as well, exactly along those lines, where you create an open space, an honest space to have those extremely difficult conversations without judgment, and to get that articulation out there. And it can be a really effective way of changing the narrative, or starting to change the culture from that perspective. Maggie, can I come to you now to pick up on the idea of addressing the victim angle, the penalisation of victims, the feelings of being investigated and being outcast? Okay.
I think it's absolutely vital for all the reasons others on the call this afternoon are saying. Absolutely essential that we support those victims and witnesses coming forward with concerns. Now, I know that's already happening really well in some forces. I know from the force that I've come from, sort of having listening circles, really reinforcing with frontline supervisors the importance of having conversations and having open conversations on a regular basis as a team, to set that expectation and to set that transparency and openness around ways of working together. So I think it needs to come from the top, but I also need to think it's about leadership throughout the organisation that's so important. And certainly in some police forces, there's big messaging on that at the moment. Talking to the Supes Association, Superintendents Association, for example, they've done quite a lot of work in the last 6 months in supporting listening circles, staff networks, staff associations, to support anyone who's coming forward to challenge or raise concerns about another member of staff or an officer's behaviour. So I think we've still got a way to go around that, because it is part of the culture change. But I can see it's already happening in some organisations and happening well, and we need to accelerate that so that we're not in a position where the first time that usually a woman, usually a female, comes forward to express concern or complain, or at worst to disclose an offence has happened, that those individuals, those usually women, need to be really supported in what's happened. And I think we can improve some of our systems still nationally to make sure that is the case, because as has just been expressed so well, it's those first experiences and the reception that you get when you complain, or whether you feel shut down, that will make the difference, and will make the difference as to whether you feel policing is somewhere where you want to stay and work.
Can I come to you, Sylvia? Do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that it's really important that this is also done very safely. So if somebody comes forward, a victim or intelligence or whatever it is, that somebody might be the perpetrator, I think it might be worthwhile having a perpetrator panel, similar to like a MARAC, where you can get different agencies. Well, in MARAC, it would be people like social care or probation or whoever, you know, alcohol charity or a domestic abuse charity, people that are, you know, in sorry, I'm just multitasking here. I have to lower my hand. People that are involved with that police officer. So it could be social care, because it has been known that police officers are able to charm social care and look at that the primary victim and then blame the real victim for being a poor mother or whatever. And agencies do tend to, you know, agree with the police officer because of his status. So having you know, people around them, like a circle around them, to get this intel from. So it could be their ex-partners, their partners, it could be, you know, work colleagues, it could be, you know, people they might socialize with, you know, anybody, you know, and just trying to get that intel and working together to make it a safe, whatever intervention and whatever intelligence is out there, to have like a plan so that that victim is not going to then be, you know, taken revenge upon by the perpetrator.
Thank you, Sylvia. We're already starting to talk about how we bring about change and intervention. So I want us to carry on with this theme until the end of the debate now. And one of the areas that I wanted to mention next was Operation Satira, so a programme that encourages forces in the CPS to focus on rape and sexual offence investigations on the suspect rather than on the victim. So very much picking up on what we're already discussing here. So looking at improving communication with victims, as well as victims' experiences of the criminal justice system itself. So it's out there at the moment, but it's just currently with a handful of forces. And the question here is this any more than a half-hearted attempt or an approach to change the focus from perpetrators? And how will it impact male violence in policing? So Maggie, can I come to you first on this, please?
Yes, thank you. I think the early findings from Opsiteria are really optimistic and offer us a really strong way forward to learn and review what works in policing, in public protection, in tackling violence against women and girls, in tackling any matters relating to VAUG, and indeed have some, I think, some real opportunity for what our operating model looks like, how our workforce is made up. And in conversation with Chief Constable Sarah Crew, who leads on rape and serious sexual offences for the National Police Chiefs Council, she will say very, very clearly there's some really strong opportunities here to radically change the way that policing works. And the early findings show that not just for rape and serious sexual offences, but also for other VAUG-related offending, if we keep that offender focus, that perpetrator focus, and we provide support around the victim, not just from within policing, but from outside policing too, those are things I think for any one of us working in public protection we can relate to, that those things really do work. And I think if we look at the outcomes from Opsiteria in the forces where it's been applied in pilot form, there's an increase in charge, there's an increase in confidence of victims to feel that their concerns, what they're disclosing, is being listened to and being acted upon. And there's support to the policing workforce involved in what are often really horrible, difficult, terrible crimes to be supported in the work that they're doing and to have adequate resourcing to do that. And I think where some of the findings from Opsiteria provide a real blueprint for moving forward is how do we train our investigators in the VAUG world, indeed in public protection? How do we train other police staff and officers that work in tackling offences against women and girls generally? How do we support them? What does that training look like? What would we want of the College of Policing over the next few years in relation to training for those in public protection? And what messages do we give out to those wanting to join policing of what the work entails? And I think there's some really strong messaging that can go out to potential new recruits to say, if you really want to make a difference to how safe our communities feel, to tackle some of the worst crimes, which are domestic abuse, stalking, rape and serious sexual offences, go after those usually male perpetrators. This is a job for you. This is a job where you can make a real difference to how women and girls feel safe on a daily basis. And that, to me, is part of the change that we want to see in policing, where violence against women and girls, VAUG, is given absolutely the highest priority in terms of resourcing, workforce allocation, and support to making a difference. So yes, I think it's very promising indeed.
Thank you, Maggie. Faye, can I come to you now for your thoughts on this and that transition from suspect to thinking about not thinking necessarily about the victim's credibility?
It's not an operation I'm massively familiar with, but from what Maggie says, I think it sounds absolutely fantastic, and it's really encouraging to see that there's been some good results from it already. In some of the work that I've done on rape attrition, one of the things that I found was around about a fifth of people that were reporting rape whose cases were subsequently discontinued, normally because of lack of evidence. They would say that they were not ready to support, and what we found was little to suggest that forces were actually going back and saying, well, how can we support you? And to hear that actually could be happening now is fantastic, because that would potentially enable a lot of cases that would otherwise just disappeared off the system to be, to allow these victims to be supported through what is a very, very stressful and horrendous process to go through. So I think it sounds like a fantastic initiative, especially if it supports those who are uncertain of the process they're about to go through and how difficult it might be.
Thank you, Faye. Colin, can I come to you for your thoughts on this now, please?
Yeah, like Faye, I'm not familiar with the actual programme itself, but I think that, again, one of the things we would definitely advocate for in terms of perpetrator work is anything that makes the sort of perpetrator up front and central to the process, and I think that's really, really, really important. And I think one of often the difficulty with investigating DV cases, for example, is that quite often our experience of that has been that the victim becomes central because she's seen as the only person that's going to be able to provide evidence, and it's, I've tried to have I've been lucky enough at sometimes to have more candid conversations with sort of some people within policing around other evidence that they could look for and that they could gather, for example. And it's really interesting because if I ask that question in a public forum, I will get an answer that befits the public forum, I would suggest, which is that, well, no, these are our processes and this is exactly what we do. Away from that, off the record, I've had officers tell me that doesn't take place, that what you're asking, sometimes really simple stuff like knocking on neighbours' doors doesn't happen, and there might be a variety of reasons for it, but I think anything that sort of moves that balance back in towards sort of concentrating on the perpetrator and how are we going to kind of bring that person to account, I think is got to be the way to go, and because we do it in other areas. If someone burgles my house, I'm not expected to provide all the vital evidence that's going to go out and catch the burglar. And I know that you're not necessarily considering apples for apples there, but I think in terms of that sort of culture shift, I think that's really important. I think what Maggie was saying around helping officers recognise the importance of what they're doing and actually wanting people to go out and effectively do what, when policing works well, that's what policing does best, is they catch bad people, and they take them out of society and they get them imprisoned. And I think anything that supports that is really, really, really vital. And the other thing I would add to that is kind of similar conversations that I've had with people within social care, for example, is also expecting to make the same demands on people. So within a public protection sort of narrative, very often what you'll get is a massive emphasis on what, you know, very often as a mother will have to do in order to safeguard and everything else. And we don't yet across the board make the same demands on perpetrators of abuse. And I think, again, that sort of cultural shift to making the perpetrator central to the interventions is really, really, really important. Because if you don't do that, what ends up happening is you end up putting victims in a position where they're expected to police their own safety. And that's just not viable. So yeah, that I would absolutely support anything that puts, you know, perpetrators up front and center.
Thank you. Maggie, I think you might want to come in anyway, but what I'd like to do is just to come to the VOG framework that you published in December 2021, and come to you first on this. Published a couple of months ago now. What are your reflections on the framework now that it's been published and it's in the public domain? And do you think the changes that are included in there are going to go far enough?
Thank you. I think it's really important, first and foremost, that there is a national strategy in essence. We call it a delivery framework that allows every one of the 43 forces to understand the 3 key pillars for change around tackling violence against women and girls. So the first pillar is trust and confidence, and it's absolutely imperative that every force it ensures that not just the confidence of women and girls reporting VOG-related crime, but the high standard of conduct amongst our officers and staff is held. And that shining the light that we've talked about on this programme, the importance of calling out poor behaviour, that to me is essential as pillar 1. But the second pillar, which is relevant to what we've heard this afternoon, around the focus on perpetrators, we know that victims need to be supported, and of course they must, but our job in policing and what we can do with our policing powers is that relentless focus on the perpetrators, again, usually, not always, but male perpetrators, and calling out for what it is, male violence against women and girls. And I think the third one is where, and I'll move on to this in answering your question about does it go far enough, the national framework. The third pillar is on safer spaces. My aspiration and vision for women and girls is feeling safe everywhere, in public, behind closed doors and online. Now, policing can only do this if we work in partnership with other sectors, with some of the expertise and specialism on this programme today, but the many organisations that have been working in this space for the last few decades. I think we have an opportunity in time now, on the back of the pandemic and the focus that the media has given to what happens behind closed doors to many women and girls, the focus of Everyone's Invited website, and then the absolute tragedies of some of the deaths of some women over the last few months that have really brought to the public eye the epidemic that is violence against women and girls. So that change is going to take longer, and it relies on a number of organisations, of sectors working together to really make these changes lasting. And those changes, in my view, and this is where I think it is a public health issue, the changes have got to be about a very focused, radical overhaul of our criminal justice system, has got to be about educating men and boys at a very early age around behaviour and conduct. We've heard a lot this afternoon about behaviour change underpins perpetrator behaviour. Thirdly, online harm, the challenges and complexity of policing in the 21st century, and all that goes with online access to violence, harm, pornography, etc., and women and girls feeling safe. And I think those coming together, those areas, if we really are serious to make changes, we can, but it is going to take time. we talked already that you don't change perpetrator behaviour overnight by one training programme. We don't change attitudes and behaviours in society overnight. But I do believe, in the same way that we've changed attitudes to a range of other public health issues over the last 30 years, we can make some real inroads here if we work together. So from my perspective, this is holding policing to account, our 43 police forces to account in terms of tackling VORG. But the next step has got to be, what do we do in partnership with other sectors to bring that systems-wide change that we really need and women and girls have a right to expect.
Thank you, Maggie. Sylvia, I'll come to you next for your thoughts on the framework. So if you can take the floor.
Yeah, I think, putting victims at the centre of everything is really important. Shining the light on perpetrators, but keeping victims at the heart of it. I think also it's really important to understand that victims, if they're going to be saying something, they might still have, Stockholm syndrome or trauma bonding with their perpetrator. So if they are going to be working with professionals, they might be saying, oh no, the perpetrator is, I love him, but wouldn't be able to say what they love about him, or he's a perfect dad, but they wouldn't be able to sort of quantify why they're a perfect father, or he's really helpful, etc. So I think the important thing here is to work with organizations that are experienced with domestic abuse and all learn from each other. And just challenge perpetrators and hear victims out.
Thank you, Sylvia. Colin, can I come to you next for your thoughts on the framework and how we move forward from the position that we're in at the moment? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think Maggie made a really important point in terms of some of this the only way you'll really succeed in this is if there's the will to support and drive the change. And I don't think that's just from within policing. I think that they'll need support politically and a will to make those changes, really. Because you can see parallels across sectors, I would argue. Within sort of early help and social care, there's a really good paper called The First 1,000 Days. And it clearly shows, for example, that if we invest in the sort of early years of a child's life, then the outcomes for that child are much, much greater. So very often some of the stuff that we want to do and we want to change exists. We even know how to do it. It's just whether or not there's the kind of will from outside to sort of drive that through. And I think you can't really underestimate that. That's really, really important. I also think there's within that, what also then becomes as part of that change is, if we're going to accept that, are we going to then address the sort of social change that's needed in terms of deciding as a society, deciding as a culture that these behaviours are not acceptable and will not be tolerated. And that's really, really important. And I think there are different ways you can do that. Maggie mentioned sort of important work with sort of like young boys, as and growing up and stuff like that. And there's stuff out there that we know about. There's some really interesting work done by a guy called Michael Kaufman, who helped set up White Ribbon in Canada. And he does a really interesting experiment where he goes in to talk to young boys when they're in school and asks two questions. The first question he asks is along the lines of, do you think that other boys in this class think it's acceptable to hit girls? And overwhelmingly, the vast majority of boys say, yes, we think that's true. And then he asks a second question. And the second question is, do you think it's okay to hit girls? And the overwhelming response is, no, it's not. So there's a majority there of young boys that think the behaviour is not okay, but they're not really saying anything about it or doing anything about it because they think that everybody else thinks it is okay. So there's something about changing and shifting those mindsets so that actually those views become the majority in terms of, supporting, and I would argue within institutions as well, how you then support officers within institutions, like the police, how you support social workers and so on, is by making that kind of behaviour unacceptable. And actually it's everybody's job to call that out. I think if you can get that kind of political will and support going, then I think all those things become infinitely more possible.
And you've got a really good example of different organisations working together there, haven't you? Right from the very earliest, early years education, right through to more community-based organisations into adulthood as well. Thank you, Colin. Faye, can I come to you now for your thoughts on this? Thank you.
I really like what Colin said about the early years aspect. And one of the things that I found through my research is that you look at research which is over 20 years old, saying that misogyny and sexism is ingrained and accepted within the police. And you look at research published 3 years ago, and it's essentially saying the same thing. It's saying that women joining policing have to subordinate their femininity, they have to assimilate, they have to put up and shut up to a certain extent. And that needs to flip round to it being completely unwelcome in policing. There is no place for people that behave like that. And I think those changes are hard to make, but they are being made. And I really hope that that continues. And the other thing from what Maggie said about multi-agency working, I think is absolutely critical. Durham Constabulary hosted the first multi-agency conference for abusive position last year, where they were very honest and open with social workers, IDVAs, paramedics, people from probation and prison services about the issue of abusive position in the police and what to look out for, what they can do to help the police. I thought that was a really, really important step forward there. And also from some of the cases I've looked at, the victims of police perpetrator abusive position, they don't report to the police, they report to their social worker, they report to their IDVA. It's critical that those people then know exactly what to do in terms of supporting that person and raising awareness of the police. And then, of course, there's the risk assessment work that I've been doing that will hopefully help police forces identify potential perpetrators at an early stage, which, as far as I'm aware, hasn't been done to this extent before. So, sorry, my final point as well is that we've done a little bit of research into how the public perceive police abuses of position for a sexual purpose, and there does seem to be a bit of a disconnect that of members of the public thinking that if victims are over the age of consent and the officer is, then vulnerability and anything else doesn't matter, it's not an abusive position. And I think maybe some public education about what to look out for as well might facilitate reporting and supporting of those external victims as well.
Thank you very much, Kay. That's great. Faye, sorry. Can we come to everybody now? I think we've had a fantastic discussion, and there's lots of different issues that have been drawn out. I want to give each of you the opportunity just to come back in and to take the floor for one last time and to summarise the most salient points of the discussion from your own perspective. One of the things that we haven't quite touched on is how we evidence the ideas that we've got going forward. What kind of evidence base can we use to see a difference in terms of what's working with police perpetrators and more broadly speaking as well? So Colin, can I come to you first of all, please, to summarise, and as part of that, if you could think about the evidence base and what should we be using to assess, to know that we're moving in the right direction with all of these different issues that we've been discussing today. Thank you.
Thank you. For me, I suppose the points I would really pick up on, one would be making the perpetrator, as I said, upfront and central to any kind of intervention. So I think that really has to be part of the process. In terms of how you might go about that or measure that success, I mean there are bits of research out there already in terms of what sort of programs would work with men like that. For example, a really big piece of research called the Mirabel research that was done about 2015. That's kind of already out there and stuff like that. I would also pick up on Sylvia's point around I think we still underestimate history, and I think if you look at the sort of any sort of research into sort of what's your best determinant of future behaviour, it's past history. And so I think building those systems in would be really, really useful. And I guess in terms of how you would judge some of that success, I think Maggie already mentioned that when she was talking about the VORG strategy, about the importance of confidence within that. And I think get into a place where you can work with victim services and have a proper dialogue with them around where they think they're at and how confident they are around the services that you provide, I think will be really, really important. If I could go very quickly on, on some of the cases that happened recently, one of the responses to that, and I think it was very well-meaning, was to sort of try and run a women's event in a park close to where some of these offences have taken place. And I think it came from a great place, and I think it was going to be populated by women police officers. But I think for a lot of victims groups, all that they saw was a kind of effort to gloss things over, and it wasn't real dialogue. So I think moving into a system where you can start to measure confidence of victim supporting agencies and have real dialogue of the type that Faye just mentioned that happened in Durham, I think would be a really good start to that process.
Thank you, Colin. Sylvia, can I come to you now to summarise the key things from your point and to think about this idea of evidence as well in terms of success? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a really good idea what they did in Durham, and I would really welcome that around, nationally, to be open to talking about it and having something like a perpetrator panel to discuss these people openly, but also, from an understanding point of view. So, if, like, say with drugs and alcohol, people can get help for that, or mental health, they can get help for that. But if they are abusing power, if you sense that you're going to be having a drink, you might go and get support for that. Whereas where do these people have to go if they feel that they need to improve their self-esteem or anything like that? So that is where these programs could come in, where they can actually talk about it openly in a safe environment. And I think that's where the police are really quite in a unique position, because it is illegal for them to be abusive to others and abuse power, but equally having a safe place somewhere that they could go to get support for this, and be able to help them, those that want help, but also divert and diffuse those ones and challenge those ones that don't want to change their behavior. I think that is really important to have. Sort of what works with police perpetrators and what we could use to assess it. It would come back to the risk assessments again. So as Colin and Faye were saying earlier, the static risks are what could predict the future, and to see if there is any sort of change, you could use dynamic risks. So things like empathy or insight, the lack of remorse or attitude towards the risk concerns, attitude towards the women, misogyny, anything like that, and measure the hostile misogyny, perhaps hostile sexism. Have a list of different things, maybe like wolf whistles, or saying that women are so easily offended, or it's political correctness gone wrong. Measure them about their misogyny and how their attitudes have changed. Those are the dynamic risks that you can see change if it is happening. But having that safe environment to come back to see if it is slipping, to have somewhere that they could go.
Excellent. Thank you, Sylvia. Faye, can I come to you for your final thoughts, please?
Sorry, my mic wouldn't unmute then, but it's unmuted now. I completely agree with Sylvia and Colin. I think some of the initiatives that are going on are just fantastic. I really love the idea of the police perpetrator aspect, to understand them further. And in terms of measuring success, this is research that I plan to do for the rest of my working career. It's something that my colleagues at the university are very passionate about. We have master's students, undergraduate students all looking at this. So, I'm hopeful that in 5 years' time, we can write a paper about police culture and find a significant reduction in misogyny, or, a significant increase in people coming forward and calling out behaviour, or evaluations of upstander bystander initiatives to see just how they're working and what successes there are and how we can communicate these to other forces.
Thank you, Faye. And Maggie, can I come to you for the final thoughts from you?
Yes, thank you. I think for final thoughts from me, the title of this programme is Insight into Policing Perpetrators, and we need to keep that relentless focus on perpetrators, not because that's our job, catching criminals, but also the shining the light on the toxic behaviour internally within the workforce where it does exist, and being relentless in how we root that out. That's absolutely at the bottom line of the violence against women and girls work that policing is leading on. But recognising that as part of that, we're going to see more and more police officers and staff sanctioned, more and more cases coming into the public domain. And that's going to really have an impact on trust and confidence. And therefore, we need to work with a range of different organisations and stakeholders, and with survivors' voices in that, to recognise that it may look like it's getting worse, but that's because we are calling it out. And I think that's a really important message from today. And some of the methods about how we do that, I think we've still got ways to learn. In terms of the evidence base, I'm really interested in the active bystander programme, some of the work that's already being undertaken by individuals in this country, some learning from Police Scotland, from America, that I think we can integrate into England and Wales. Really interested in work on that. And we will be measuring performance improvement, not just in VAUG offences, but also in misconduct, in terms of victim and witness satisfaction, which we hope will enable us to turn around some of the trust and confidence issues that policing is facing today.
Excellent, thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of the panel. I want to thank you all very, very much for your time today and for your honest and frank contributions. And we hope that you've enjoyed listening to our programme. Thank you all very much.